Um, I am also grateful to Professor Ajay Kumar of Litcrit for uh, being there, and it was also wonderful to listen to everyone in the morning, Professor Hariharan, the Honorable Minister, and others. With Professor, I'm also deeply honored to be on the same panel with someone like Professor Pillai, whose work I've always admired. Her writings on Gemini is something that we still talk about when we discuss the novel in class. And it was also nice to have a short, brief, albeit online, Fulbright reunion right at the beginning in our informal discussions. All right, so thank you to the person who is helping me with the PowerPoint, and I'll move on to the talk. Um, One of the first things that I would request the person who's showing it to help me to look at the first three slides one after the other, please. If the person who's doing that could show me the first three slides. Yes, the next one. And the next one, please. Right. Thank you very much. Right. One of the things that I'm doing here is a part of this, the title of this paper, especially the idea of perpetual grief, is taken from an article entitled Strength from Perpetual Grief: How Aboriginal People Experience the Bushfire Crisis. This was published in The Conversation in January 2020. And one of the things that it says is, how do you support people forever attached to a landscape after an inferno tears through their homelands, decimating native food sources, burning through ancient scarred trees, and destroying ancestral and totemic plants and animals? The disastrous and traumatic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, has in a way pushed back the horror of one of the worst bushfires in Australia in 2019-20. However, as the world continues to confront one disaster after another, and as so poignantly pointed out by Professor Pillai in the morning, we are indeed at a very important juncture to remind ourselves of the crucial role of indigenous knowledge systems towards environmental sustainability. One of the things that I would like to engage with is the relationship with land as fostered by Aboriginal communities in Australia and the role of elders in the community. The next slide, please. The next slide, as you could see, is another instance from Twitter, which was there. You can see the images over there. And one of the things it says, I hope it will recover. I hope that indigenous knowledge and expertise takes precedence in the forward management of their natural environments. This requires indigenous people and systems leading the process, not being tapped on or our knowledge excerpted and cropped, crippled into failing models. Right? And this is again an instance of the ongoing crisis that I'm talking about. Something that also happened when in September last year, I think it was in around September last year, that one had this discussion with members of Litcrit on the impact of COVID-19 and indigenous communities in India, for instance, and it brought us very deep-rooted relationships as well. Australia's oldest inhabitants have believed in a natural world that comprises beings that cooperate rather than coerce a world to fatalistic submission. Further, Aboriginal Australians believe in harmonious coexistence and not in irresponsible control of and interference in ecogenic agencies. So I'm trying to look into Aboriginal Australian interventions, which would try to explore the ethics and criteria for understanding indigenous knowledge, and for integrating it within the framework of sustainable development. Um, I'm also at this point reminded of something that Aboriginal elder Bobby Skies told. And one of the things, this was a conference on post-colonialism, and her response was, why have they left? Right? So it speaks about a continuous struggle with forces that encroach upon one's own land, upon one's own sense of being. And if you go on to the next slide, please, it will give you an instance of what I mean by perpetual grief. Uh, it's a particular grief to lose forever what connects you to a place in the landscape. Our ancestors felt it, our elders felt it, and now we are feeling it all over again as we watch how the mistreatment and neglect of our land and waters for generations and the pig-headed foolishness of coal-obsessed climate change denialists turn everything and everyone to ash. As I speak to you today, we have one of the most important climate change seminars are being held um, online, of course, in North America with indigenous communities talking about climate change and their processes of dealing with the damage that has been inflicted on our lands. And I'm tempted at here to, before I go into the Australian context, I'm also tempted at here to talk about somebody like Janet Armstrong, who is from the Okanagan in British Columbia in Canada, and who has been very vocal in her understanding of the preservation of the environment for the community that she loves and derives her inspiration from. And one of the things that she tells us is, I'm claimed and owned by this land, the Okanagan. Voices that move within as my experience of existence do not awaken as words. Instead, they move within as the colors, patterns, and movements of a beautiful, kind Okanagan landscape. It's extremely interesting because one of the words that she uses is the Sikhs word timix, and which refers, it's TMIX, which refers to the ecology of the land, including all life forms of the place, consisting of many relationships. The concept emanates from the Sikhs language and is in fact illuminated in the oral story tradition. Something that I'm going to come back to at the end of my talk. And the word things which I'm using, albeit in a Canadian context, but I find it's extremely interesting in terms of the philosophical positions followed by Aboriginal scholars in Australia, is this human duty to nature. So the word allows us to perceive, the word remix allows us to perceive the depth of the language and the seed's knowledge of ecology. It's a way to see existence in that the Phoenix is the life force of a place. So what's happening is that the seeing an image in the word in a particular way of an indigenous language is that it is trying to show us the many strands. It's a response to the moral issue of human utility of other life forms, the responsibility that has been displayed by Aboriginal communities. And it's the foundation of an egalitarian type of governance, which extends in relation to other groups surrounding the territory. So it's Aboriginal slash indigenous knowledge systems, particularly ecological knowledge, can be seen in the judicious practices arising out of the wisdom that the ecology of the territory or a living whole system. And it requires human compliance in order to have a better understanding of its regenerative requirements and to interact in ways that is not destructive, right? And that becomes extremely used, especially in terms of non-destructive use of land resources. Yeah, if you move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah. So, along with grief, there is a great deal of anger. And I think the next slide gives you an idea of this that's happening here. And what is going on in Australia? Ongoing colonization. That's what's going on. This land was nurtured in reciprocal relationships with First Nations people for some 120,000 years. And it's a result of 200 odd years of extractive invasion, right? The next slide, please. Okay. So one of the things that you see over here is indigenous knowledge and the different ways it branches out in different understanding of different ways of understanding the world around you, be it in terms of local knowledge, be it in terms of agriculture, food, biodiversity, culture, performance, education, ethics, science, technology, elders, something that I'll come back to again. The next slide, please, again. So the purpose over here is to place indigenous perspectives at the center of inquiry. And that's what's happening over here. And it involves a certain respect towards relationships, certain respect towards understanding. In the keynote address in the morning, one of the things that I was really intrigued by is as a response to a question, Professor Ryan mentioned how the word informant can be tricky. And it is indeed tricky because it speaks of disrespect, it speaks of mistrust within indigenous communities. This particular model is therefore an example of how indigenous communities try to perceive themselves, how they look into their ideas. The next slide, please. Right? So this is how indigenous information protocols work. This is how one understands the relationship between indigenous knowledge systems. One of the ways of doing this is through the role of the elders in the community. According to Yolanda Walker, it is through our elders that the spirit of Aboriginal people is kept alive. Elders are indeed integral to the indigenous space and therefore they provide a crucial site for the cross-cultural negotiation of subjectivity. So what is happening in the process is that over here, aging is recoded and re-signified, leading to the formulation of new protocols and paradigmatic shifts. Elders are within indigenous communities are marked by qualities of leadership, cultural knowledge, and the ability to execute decisions. They provide counter-imperial responses to the colonial trajectory of patriarchy, gendered violence, and social hierarchy. So often the degree of maturity in the stages of life, rather than chronological biological age, defines an elder. Further, as a repository of memory, teachings, and story, they are perceived as an institution open to possibilities of both manipulation, perhaps, and also renegotiation in the context of indigenous international bodies such as United Nations, or in terms of issues of identity, violence, and indigenous sovereignty. So, what I'm trying to look at is I'm trying to position the symbolic concept of an elder within a global setting because it paves the way, I believe, towards an apparently seamless and homogeneous reunification of indigenous communities. So, what is the role that indigenous elders have within the communities? And they try to take cognizance of the processes by which rights to imagination can have been denied actually because of the fractured politics of contemporary societies and consequent transformations. Um, Elders actually foreground the capacity of indigenous people to represent themselves and determine their futures. So, in this process, elders rearticulate indigenous subjectivity, agency, and cultural recovery. I give you one instance from Australia to prove my point. In the early 60s, the federal government of Australia, which had jurisdiction in the Northern Territory, uh, would grant a bauxite mining lease to a multinational company called Nabalco on the Arnhem Land Reserve. The decision understandably enraged Yolngu elders that included senior artists such as Mawalan Marika and Munguruwe Yunipingu, who felt that the mining would be a gross violation of the sacred sites of their homelands, and the government had no right to permit such an action without consulting the indigenous community. In the August of 1963, after the failure of their initial entreaties, the Yolngu elders devised two petitions to be presented in the Parliament of Australia. Written both in Yolngu Matha and in English, the petitions were unique as they were written onto bark, painted with Yolngu designs of charcoal, clay pipe, and ochre. The petitioners identified themselves as members of different communities across Australia. This is a very large list, and they demanded an acknowledgement of the sacred ties to the land and requested cognition of the gross neglect and injustice meted on to Aboriginal Australia. Ironically, even though from within Indigenous Australia the petitions themselves were received as foreign in terms of their format, for the Yolngu people, the petitions compelled white Australia to acknowledge the Yolngu view of life. According to an official history of Australian democracy, the petition should be perceived as first documents bridging Commonwealth law as it then stood and the indigenous laws of the land. Uh, in fact, the petition would contain clan designs of all the areas that were threatened by the mining, and not just a series of pictures, but it would represent the title of the country under law. So, and therefore there would be two panels threatened area which crossed the boundaries of the two moieties. And so this was a very interesting iconographic image that one had at that point of time. Right. Move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So if you move on to the next slide, we find, and this was something that was spoken about in the morning as well, different ways of understanding how rights are understood. Because you see, justice for the petitions that I just spoke about, justice was denied both by the Parliament and the Supreme Court. But the petitions would lead to this nationwide protest by Indigenous people of Australia. And it also led to a series of bark petitions to Australian prime ministers and the Commonwealth Parliament over the years. So now it seemed that the bark petitions are seen as a way to pave the way for Aboriginal land rights, proclaimed in 76, and it not only initiates the first legal action for land rights in Australia, but it gives coherence and power to the Aboriginal struggle in Australia and indigenized petitionary form. So you see, the bark petitions that I spoke about draw attention to perceptions of value, whereby elders attempted to create this indigenous space of negotiation within an apathetic society and sought to utilize imaginative political resources from within traditional cultures. So they're known as the Irkala Bark petitions, and it nurtured societal conversation on issues of lived experiences, shared sufferings, and orthodoxies. It offers a window to ways in which communities could take control over the forces that operate on them. The slide that you see on your screen is one way of looking at it, the idea of fires, the idea of controlled fire management practices that paved the way for healing, as I was speaking about. The next slide as well, please. Yeah. So this is another instance of patch burning in the Midlands region of Tasmania. And it's again drawing on traditional Aboriginal knowledge and in terms of modern fire management. Uh, One of the ways of also dealing with this, because we need to remember that it's not really until 1992 that Australia's High Court recognizes Aboriginal rights to land, and Eddie Koiki Mabo successfully claimed uninterrupted ownership of his people's traditional land at Mare Island. And the Australian government would finally admit, if only on an anthropocentrically logical grounds of admission, that Australia was terra nullius. So this was the falsehood of the claim. So, and one of the ways of understanding the intervention provoked or initiated by the elders through the Bark petitions or thereafter is a way of understanding a meaningful relationship that's cultivated between elders and other members of the community, which is an art in itself. So it functions as a witness to a timeless tradition, as well as a repository of memory of the complex social and material realities of contemporary indigenous communities. Um, an intervention in the context of Australia in terms of community building and continuity between generations working towards sustainability can also be seen in the Fire Sticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation. The next slide, please. So, according to their website, implementing fire to enhance ecosystem health within culturally connected landscapes, improve habitat condition and connectivity. So, Fire Sticks ultimately strives to empower Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities to work towards healthy, functional, and resilient landscapes. And such modes of intervention are crucial since a very minuscule section of Australians today have paid attention to pre-1788 human-environment relationships. One of the books that was mentioned at the keynote as well is Cranston and Zeller's eco-critical study, The Literal Zone, which testifies to these relationships in the context of Australian literary studies. You've had environmental historians like Bill Gamage, The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia, and other narratives which I'm not mentioning right now because it was also mentioned in the keynote in the morning. And also perhaps because all of these books give you a very limited body of criticism that acknowledge the role of Indigenous people in sustainability. Um, Local knowledge and spiritual bonding with the land are integral to traditional Aboriginal fire practices. In fact, before white settlement, Aboriginal people were constantly at par with the landscape and traditionally burned country by walking the land. So it basically meant that they could control the timing and spread of fire as well as its ecological effects. And one of the things that I find in this text is this whole idea of an Aboriginal person saying, they stole our land and I thought that was enough, but now they just let it bloody burn. Our Mother Earth is dying, and all we can do is to watch it die and hear her screams. She's angry at not being looked after, and I'm angry she wasn't looked after. Uh, the next slide, please. And this is one of the most important images that I feel. The next slide, please. Um, the slide which gives you a sense of Badugili. And one of the things that I wanted to show here is this. The Badugili is this First Nations connection to the land, and which is shown every year, every evening at Sydney. And this is a video that I wanted everyone to see because it is really a beautiful one. We kind of stop at 3 minutes at the video because that's just a stop, and we can continue later on. If you could show the video, please. Yeah, so this gives you an idea of the house and the video.
The Hermannsburg art movement of watercolours was founded by the famous Albert Namatjira. Mervyn Rabuncha continues painting country in that style. He paints about the Fink River at the foot of Mount Hermannsburg. It is surrounded by red desert, stunted trees and spinifex, and is flanked by the MacDonald Ranges. For his people, the Western Arunta, the deep gorges and arid plains witness harsh drought and high temperatures. As the winds move to form clouds, through the red dust we see the life grow along one of the oldest waterways. The water is there, you just need to read country. The black cockatoo is a totemic bird for Gidja peoples of the Kimberley West. It's a warning bird. Their song will alert us to impending rain, and so the seasons change with the moon cycles. Painted by Mabel Julie, she only uses ochre and tells the well-known dreaming story of the stars and moon and the paintings of mountains on her father's country. She paints country and explores climate change within her stories.
Thank you.
Debashri, your mic is off. Kindly unmute yourself.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. So one of the things that we must acknowledge and understand is the traumatic colonial practices of the past 200 plus years and the traumatic inheritance of dislocation, dispossession, assimilation, and racism that has been integral to indigenous communities and which continues to affect different indigenous communities across the world, India not being far behind. So the bushfire adds on to this layer of trauma and complexity that perhaps triggered past traumas as well, not only to indigenous communities as a collective, but also individual members of the community. And it is in this context, therefore, that remembrance becomes imperative. And I end with this particular poem by Leonel Pagati, and I'm going to just read the last stanza and I will end there. It's called ecology. Later, I'm digging sticks. Then I'm seeds winnowed for damper. I'm club, woomera, an agile, well-balanced bandicoot, flying fox and an aboriginal. Our systems woven from an ecosystem. So don't send us to pollution. We are just trying to picture this life without frustration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Devashri. Uh, I don't know how is this program conceived. Do I respond to her or Suja?
Yes, ma'am. You
Okay,
respond and then the questions can be
okay,
put in the chat box.
okay. Uh, I think Devashri's very informative talk. What she was trying to do through that was to take a look at the crucial role that uh, indigenous tribes and indigenous knowledge systems have nurtured towards environmental sustainability. That was the crux of the argument that she was trying to make. In this context, she was talking about the role of the elders of the community, of indigenous communities, who very inherently believed in a natural world that comprises beings that cooperate rather than coerce. Maybe that's where there are very significant parallels that we have with our own tribal cultures and tribal indigenous knowledge systems. She also talked about the kind of harmonious coexistence that is at the root of these their philosophies, deeper philosophies with regard to environment, with regard to ways of living, with regard to livelihoods, etc. She talked about the interventions made by these Aboriginal elders. I found that extremely interesting, the kind of petitioning that happened on their part, uh, and she tried to explore the ethics, therefore, the necessity also of understanding indigenous knowledges and for integrating them within our own sustainable development goals. What is very interesting, what I found very interesting in her talk was the parallels that can be drawn. See, for example, fire management techniques that the many of the indigenous tribes use, even here in India, as also in Australia. I think there are different names by which they are called, but I think in Australia they're called cultural burns, which are practiced by indigenous communities. They actually burn. They let the wood burn because they think that what is created needs also to be destroyed. But this is not a destructive burning in that sense. It's a cool burning, where there are blazes which will not go beyond the height of a human knee. Very carefully designed cool burning. Continuously, it keeps on burning across the landscape, but it doesn't destroy ecosystems. It doesn't destroy, in the same manner and in the same magnitude as the raging bushfires. So there are fires, definitely, but there is a philosophy underneath that, of creation, of preservation and destruction, which I think is also part of, our own Indian philosophies, where it comes in a cyclical pattern. It is part and parcel of the way in which life itself functions. So a deeper philosophy rather than the consuming bushfires of today. But then her paper also set me thinking, even as we talk about two entirely different, maybe dialectically opposed ways of looking at, deeper philosophies of looking at forests and ecosystems and space and time. At the same time, in the context of the huge paradigm shifts, the huge tectonic shifts that have happened as far as human habitations are concerned. The way our greed has maybe destroyed, even as I'm talking, some endangered species across the globe are being destroyed. So that is the pace at which, that is the way in which things are dying out right in front of our eyes. But even as we lament their loss, I think the question that she was also trying to raise is, how do we narrate this grief? How do we talk about this grief? How do we maybe transform a deep personal understanding of this grief, the lament that stems from within us, into a social lament, a lament that will chart the history of my society, maybe forge deeper bonds that will, for all times, prevent or help prevent the repetition of such disasters. What is very interesting is that someone called Maurice Blanchard argues that narrating disaster, whether it be global, whether it be national, whether it be local or personal, is an impossible task. Because to narrate a disaster, to narrate a grief, it's so difficult to articulate it. Of course, we try different ways by which we articulate grief, but how do we articulate? How do we really articulate what is deep within? That is so traumatic that it has created a schism in our own being. It has created ruptures in our souls. How do we narrate it? How do we narrate grief? I thought that the way the paper tried to move towards that was very interesting. So in a sense, it is also the limit of writing, as many people have argued, because language fails you. You who believe that you are the keeper of such a wonderful language, the felicity with which you express. But there are times, there are points in your life when, and maybe the bushfire, I think, is definitely one such instance, where you look at this raging, consuming fire, and there is a lament that rises up within you. There is a lament that cannot be curbed, but it is also a lament that cannot be described. It's a lament that cannot be written, because it is a lament where language fails you. Literally speechless. You lack the language to talk about it, to express it in maybe decipherable human terminology. So as I was thinking about this question that the paper raised about how do we articulate our grief, I was also reminded of a very significant passage from Roland Barthes. Barthes, I just want to quote him there. Barthes said, I quote him, "There is a time when death is an event, an adventure, and as such mobilizes, interests, activates, tetanizes. And then one day, it is no longer an event. It is another duration, compressed, insignificant, not narrated, grim, without recourse. True mourning, not susceptible to any narrative dialectic. Tragedies often have all the making of the event that Barthes was trying to narrate. Maybe when I read Barthes in this context, I thought of this event that Barthes was trying to talk about, that initially mobilizes, that initially sparks interest, but then after a certain time it becomes compressed, it becomes insignificant. I think that is the move that we need to stop here. Maybe a conference of this kind will help us not to get to a point where we think that such fires, such raging, consuming fires are insignificant, are too grim to be narrated. I think that is the point when silence pervades. That is the point when we fail as cartographers of grief. Let us not reach that point. Let us continue to talk about this grief. let us continue to mourn. I was also thinking of that very popular film Rudali, where this whole idea of people coming to mourn with you, to lament with you, to beat their breasts and cry, attempting to narrate a grief that still remains unnarratable. So it is. These are the thoughts that Debashree's paper sparked off in me. I think they are very, very significant pointers, both to some of the interventions that Aboriginal knowledge systems can engender at one level, but also to the necessity of maybe becoming the cartographers of grief in our own times, not to be desensitized, not to be tetanized, not to be pervaded by silence in such a manner that we fail to respond to the grief itself. I think that is the purpose of conferences and seminars and presentations like this. I don't know whether I've done justice to Debashree's paper, but I would like to say that the paper is now open for discussion. If there are questions, if there are queries, I'm sure that she would be most happy to address them. Thank you so much, Debashree.
Thank you very much for the beautiful response.
The session is now open for questions and responses from the speakers we have today. I'm Shalini Srinivasan from English Department, University College, and I will be proposing the word of thanks. And before that, we will be having the Q&A session. I'm incredibly glad to join this session because Debashree Dattare, Dr. Debashree Dattare is a new figure for me, unfortunately, but Dr. Meena Pillai did teach me for a year. So if there are, maybe I could start with a question. What I am concerned is with two things. How do we reconcile the practices of modern science with what Aboriginal indigenous knowledge can offer us? And secondly, can the modern lifestyle, as it has been established right now, a lifestyle of greed, be ever reconciled with the wise, non-anthropocentric practices of our indigenous people? Is that ever possible?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think they're very, very important questions. And I'll come back to the first one later because the second one is easier to answer and the quick answer would be no. Because I think there's always this process of disjunct, there's a process of not really being able to make the two worlds meet in different ways, right? So that's something that has been happening. But the second one is very easier to answer because the second one has a more concrete response. You have, as of now, institutions, organizations around the world trying to build up, trying to give access to indigenous knowledge systems within Western science, within science. For example, a couple of years ago, I was invited to South Africa. And one of the reasons I was invited by the Department of Physics, by the School of Physics. And as you know, my profile has nothing to do with physics. But the reason that I went in was because of these indigenous knowledge. There were people from indigenous communities over there at these classes. And one of the things the person who invited me was having a hard time was trying to, speak science to indigenous communities and also take cognizance of what they are trying to say, right? And this was good because this was a good scientist who was not dismissal of the indigenous knowledge system, but that also works within different universities, within different institutions across the world right now. So you have actual institutions that try to engage with these studies. So there is a possibility of, and especially probably more with the biosciences than maybe with physics or chemistry, but certainly with the biosciences and others. And for example, in West Bengal, you have the university, the Shibukala University, which is an indigenous university. And they have these specific departments that do not really work in terms of anthropological surveys, but actually try to engage with the community and try to bring in knowledge systems from the community within the different departments. Because we're talking also about the process of interdisciplinarity. The tribal summit that I just spoke about, that's happening in North America right now, uh, involves philosophers, scientists, students of literature. Everyone is on the table with their ability to understand the world around them. So I think that kind of engagement is happening, so which is good. And perhaps if that engagement is sustained in terms of, there's one part that a lot of us will understand here, there's an administrative part to it. There's an administrative part to it, there's a bureaucratic part to it. But I think that is happening right now in terms of indigenous knowledge, in terms of different universities working with endangered languages, for instance. Because the moment you have access to endangered languages, you have access to certain belief systems, certain ideas, right? And I think that's also working, and that's not being relegated only to the humanities, but also to other disciplines. I'm hoping that answers part of the question that you asked. And there are also collaborations in the UK that's happening between disciplines. We are collaborating as well with, for example, New Zealand and the Pacific, which was also mentioned in the keynote in the morning. And that's also another way of intervention that's possible.
I think if I may add to that, to the very significant question that Shalini raised, I was also thinking the ways by which, there are erasures that are effected in the mundane and the everyday. Say, for example, the kind of schooling that we give indigenous people is systematically geared towards erasures of their knowledge systems. They are no longer equipped in any sense to practice what they have been born with, an innate sense of maybe their ecosystems, how to thrive in them, how to maybe make survival possible. All these are systematically erased, and we give them a different set of tools, which I think is suicidal for the kind of knowledge systems that we are talking about here. So I don't know. I think this is also a point that needs to be taken into consideration.
Thank you. Do we have more questions?
Hello. Hello,
Yes,
ma'am.
yes, sir.
Okay. What I wanted to, yeah, we were talking about this systematic erasure, and one thing that I really wanted, put out there is when we look at these international organizations, say like UNEP, we have the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. All these institutions organized, whatever is done in an organized manner, everywhere, these systems of knowledge, these indigenous traditions, they are probably not at all represented. Uh, I was thinking, is that a result of the fact that these are all systems based on the capitalist mode of thinking? And and if so, what can be done about that?
Shall I respond?
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Thank you very much. Very interesting and passionate question. One of the things that I want to tell you, I think I can tell you what's being done, and I understand the cynicism that comes in when you're talking about bodies that are well known. But like I continue to say, and one of the plus points of COVID-19, if you call it a plus point, has been, I mean, okay, let's say one of the points that is good with COVID, not as good about COVID-19, but this one of the things that has happened is, and I'm speaking as a scholar in Indigenous studies here, is this extensive collaborations between Indigenous communities that has happened for the last 1.5 years. And that's also because finance is no longer an issue. I'm talking about logistics here. You don't have to buy the plane tickets to be there. You just go and talk to these people. And because everyone is stuck at home, that becomes easier, right? So these collaborations and these partnerships have happened. And I'm hoping that when we open up, these collaborations can be nurtured in a more constructive way. And I'm very wary of using the word collaboration here because collaboration is always suspect in the indigenous world. I mean, there's no thing as a fair collaboration. It doesn't happen. But it is happening over here right now because it's indigenous communities who come to speak. I work with Northeast India to a large extent, and one of the things that my friends told me is that we've had it enough. Right now, if you want to talk about indigenous knowledge, we are going to talk about it. Nobody else is going to tell things on our behalf. So I'm hoping, Gokul, that answers your question, that these collaborations are happening and they're gaining a recognition because you actually have bodies now which would support collaborations that are purely indigenous rather than having someone who is working from the outside. So that's a good thing that's happening. Hope that answers the question. Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions? May I continue with that? I think what Mr. Gokul was trying to point out is whether this sort of intervention, this sort of new knowledge would ever become mainstream, would ever, this was also something that I was concerned with before. How can, you talked about the bark petitions and all that. There are these iconographic and symbolic gestures that really got people to respond. This imaginative political resources, I'm quoting you. In a comparatively egalitarian society like Australia, maybe that has worked, but is it truly possible in a country like India where the exploitation goes so deep down and the identities are in a process of being erased? That is one thing I was really concerned about. Are these imaginative? So, because it broke my heart to see the Haka dance and all that being performed at the Standing Rock protest, but nothing really came out of it. The Dakota pipeline still went through. So, as somebody who has to live for another 50 years, let's say, I'm really concerned whether such symbolic gestures would really make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, and I understand again where this comes from. There are two things. As far as India is concerned, it is religious community structures, indigenous communities within India are far more complex, and I don't think I can do justice by responding to the Indian context here, given the kind of time we have. It's very complex, and for example, I mean, I can also tell you that, and something that we all know over here is the kind of racism that was directed towards indigenous communities at the beginning of the pandemic, right? Especially communities from the Northeast. And I think that was very problematic. Something that happens, given that scenario, how does their knowledge systems even get recognition? It's a difficult proposition. But there are baby steps that are being taken, and there are two ways of doing it. One is just not to being hopeful at all and not really worry about it at all, and then you don't do anything about it. But then one, continues to strive and trying to understand some steps that we could take and to acknowledge these processes. I can also talk about, for example, the in May 2020, May 2021, 14, there were around these mass graves that were found in Kamloops residential school of children, which triggered this traumatic history of residential school in Canada. And then, they're literally digging graves across the country with all of these children. And this has led to a large scale movement that's happening as well. Think about the Black Lives Matter movement and whatever happened. At the end of the day, even after George Floyd, we know of instances where Black people have been victimized, have been threatened, have faced the brunt of exploitation. But it does not take away the impact of what the BLM did. Did it do the same thing for Dalit lives in India? So these are questions that also need to be, uh, answered. But I guess that would require another seminar. So I think that's one of the things that you did.
But while I completely agree with you that Devashri, I still believe in response to Shalini's question, the second part of this, the conference title there is very relevant because in a post-truth era where a lot of these oppositions, symbolic or otherwise, are dying down or dying out or not being given even visibility in mediascapes. I think it's very important that we keep on protesting, symbolic or otherwise. To fuel protest, to keep it burning, I think is very important also.
Yes, I think so too, because you have to ask. I mean, that's what my point was. I mean, either you don't do anything, but then how can you not do anything? One has to do something. So you go on
Something.
teaching stuff and talking about stuff that needs to be talked about. And I think Professor Pillai has been a good example of that.
Yeah,
So, I
a
mean,
very good example.
very good example, phenomenal example as well as concerned. So I think that is also something that needs to be done. Yeah. I hope between the three of us we managed to respond to Mr. Gokul. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think yeah, cool.
More questions?
Yeah, I think that's it.
Yes. I have so many questions, but yes, there's another time for
Yeah,
that.
I would have liked. I think we're glad. I'm glad we met. So, so
Thank you
yeah,
so much.
glad. Yeah.
So I'll move on to the official part of my duty, I guess. Uh, it is to propose a vote of thanks. I would first of all like to propose a vote of thanks to Dr. Debashri Dattare, Associate Professor, Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University. Uh, this is both from the department, from the university, and personally from my end. Indigenous issues and indigenous knowledge is something that we talk about a lot, but to get some concrete instances of it, to get some clarity on it, to see what can be practically done rather than theorizing about it, or even theorizing about something as untheorizable as grief, if even if that is even a word. To talk about that, you have given us some, as I said, very concrete examples of how to resist and how resistance has succeeded, and how in the question and answer session you have explained how these kinds of interventions and these kinds of expansions of the idea of knowledge into non-hegemonical areas is probably going to work out for the future. So this is a very optimistic way of looking at the world, and we do need better solutions than we have right now. And thank you for illuminating all of the different movements that have been going on in the world. And thank you once again for reiterating that the symbolic is just as powerful as the concrete. Even if we don't make a change today from your lecture, we feel that there will be a change tomorrow, and something to look forward to. Thank you so much for doing that for us, ma'am. And respondent, Dr. Meenati Pillai, who is Dean Faculty of Arts, University of Kerala, and my very dear teacher. There is something that she said to us a very long time ago at the end of uh, uh, coverage of feminism, I think. Now that you're awake, can you ever go back to sleep again? I think I very rudely asked her, are we really awake? Or something of that sort. But in my years of teaching, I have tried to wake up as many people as possible. And I would say that it is she who single-handedly made me that person who tries to wake other people up. So the same thing that she did here. We had a lecture, and then she represented that lecture in a way that puts it in a certain context and makes it more cohesive to understand it in its fullest extent, possibly. So thank you for that. And after this kind of a session, if it's a fruitful session, one would feel that it should go on for some time more so that we can talk about things. And that is what both of the panelists today have done for us. And I'm so very thankful for both our panelists, to both our panelists, both from my end, personally, from my department, from University College and the University of Kerala for giving us such a wonderful session. Thank you so much. This was a very optimistic way of looking at the world. Thank you.
We will deal with that optimism over coffee someday, I'm sure. We need to do that as well.
And Debashri, I must say that before this August audience, I must say that I'm a very proud teacher today. Shalini has done me proud. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
No, I'm glad I met somebody. I'm looking forward to talking to her in person sometime. Hopefully.
Thank you so much.